expertise that they bring to the inquiries that we'll be posing on the webinar today. And if you would also put yourself on mute, I believe Melanie, our senior program manager, has already put most folks on mute, but sometimes there are quirks of that. So if you just put yourself on mute, all of the communications that we'll be doing other than between myself and the research teams will be done using the chat box, and you can open that box with the button on the right-hand side of your screen there. That'll open it up. So a little bit about the flow here today. In a moment, I will stop talking and hand the reins and the presentation to Carrie and Tori. They will present for a significant chunk of this hour's time today, and then toward the end, we're going to leave enough time for Q&A. As we get to that point, we'll ask folks to start asking their questions that they would like to pose to the research team in the chat box here, and Melanie and I will curate those, and then I will speak those aloud, and then we'll have the conversation back and forth live here on the call. Also note that this will be recorded for later uploading to the Student-Centered Learning Research Collaborative set of resources that are largely hosted on the Students at the Center hub. So if you can only catch a portion of today, or you know other people who would want to benefit from this at a later juncture, please look for that upload. It takes a little while for us to capture it and to format it and stuff. So usually a week or two later, it'll be up and available free to anyone on the interwebs. So with that, just want to introduce real quick the research team, give a very quick background about this. The American Institutes of Research conducted the study as part of the Research Collaborative's initial cycle of research from 2016 to 2018. The team at AIR worked alongside fellow scholars, other research teams, educators, policymakers to investigate the impact of specific student-centered practices and then translate their findings for cross-sector audiences. This webinar is part of that translation for cross-sector audiences. Their final report is freely available on our website, and it represents their work over the past 2 years as they designed, they tested, and they revised a series of teacher practices as part of a networked improvement community using improvement science approaches, and they examined how student agency can impact academic outcomes. We'd love you all to realize that this study is generously funded by the Nellie Mae Education Foundation and the Overdeck Family Foundation. Without their support, none of this would have been possible, so we're deeply grateful for both foundations' support of this particular study and the studies over the last 2-year cycle of the Research Collaborative. So with that, I'll hand it off to Carrie and Victoria. Again, super thrilled to work with the AIR team and excited to hear what they have to tell us today. Carrie and Tori.
Thanks, Eric. Hi, everyone. This is Tori Sparks. As Eric mentioned, my colleague Carrie Schultz and I are going to be presenting today some of the work that we've conducted in partnership with the Student-Centered Learning Research Collaborative and 4 New Tech Network high schools, really to start to examine and try to identify what teacher practices can really promote student agency. There's a lot of research out there that tells us that paying attention to promoting and developing agency in students has positive outcomes for students, but less is known about which practices can actually help support that. So really the focus of this study is trying to find out information about these practices, what practices teachers are using, and then using a continuous improvement, networked improvement approach to test out those practices to see how well they're working and with what students. So thank you for joining us today. One key member of our team is missing, Chrissy Zeiser, but for good reason. She just had a new baby. So it's very exciting, but we wish she was here. So Carrie and I are going to do our best to give you an overview of the study, knowing that there is not a lot of time in the hour. And over the course of the webinar, please submit questions in the chat box. We will be asking you to submit some of your thoughts, try to make this a little interactive as well. And to start off, while we kind of do some of these introductory pieces about the study, if you could drop into the chat box how you define agency or what you think agency might be. In the webinar announcement and registration, we included a link to a short video that we made as part of the study, where we heard from one of our students, Belleville New Tech in Michigan, from students and from teachers, how they think of agency. But we'd love to hear how you define it. And if you hadn't had a chance to take a look at those videos, don't do it now. We don't want to lose you, but I'm going to put the link in the chat box so that you can click on it and watch it after the webinar today. And we have a few more that we'll talk about throughout the course of the webinar. What we're going to be doing today, so as again we talk, please feel free to share. What we'd like to do today, and again if you are new to WebEx, the slide on the screen will tell you and point you into the direction of where to put that information. But want to echo what Eric said in terms of our appreciation for the Student-Centered Learning Research Collaborative and its funders and their generous support of this study. We also want to thank two really important people, our distinguished fellows that have worked and provided guidance to us across the life cycle of this study, Kim Carter and Dana Mitra. And last but not least, just the students and the teachers, and in particular Drew Schrader, with the New Tech Network schools. We have asked them over the course of the study to engage in a lot of different types of data collection activities that you'll hear about today, including student surveys, teacher focus groups, and then really the meat of the work, which was the networked improvement community, which is time intensive, data intensive, and just want to thank all of the New Tech Network students and teachers for their participation. So before we dig into the nuts and bolts of the study, I wanted to give you a sense of what we're going to talk about today. So we're first going to talk a little bit about how we define student agency for purposes of the study. We're going to talk to you and share with you the practices that the teachers involved in these four, or working in these four schools, reported using in their daily practice to promote agency. We're going to talk a little bit about what this networked improvement community was and how it works. Some of you might be new to improvement science or to networked improvement communities. So I want to give you a little bit of a background there, but also really talk to you about how it was used and how the teachers engaged in this process to learn about their practice. So we'll summarize some of those lessons learned, and then we want to share with you before we leave today just some additional resources so that you can learn more either about this and next or about other research and resources available through the Student-Centered Learning Research Collaborative. So let's circle back to what is agency. While most of the webinar today is going to focus on how the networked improvement community and the teachers involved in that community from those schools really work to identify practices and tests, we thought it might be helpful to ground the conversation first in how we defined and measured student agency as part of the study. And some of the things that you might have seen if you had a chance to watch the video, or some of the things that might have come to mind as you were thinking about, how do I define student agency? Might be things like students taking ownership or responsibility for their work, students asking for help and seeking out feedback, really students understanding the power that they have over the direction of their own education and where the importance of growth mindsets, and all of those are correct. All of those are part of agency. All of those are part of the things that we heard from the students and teachers of the study schools and how they think about student agency. But for the purposes of this study, we define agency as the ability of students to really manage their learning and be successful in school. And there's a couple different ways that we tried to measure this. Again, as we dig into the networked improvement community aspect of the project, you'll hear about more practical measures, more day-to-day classroom-based measures. But we also had a part of the study where we used 8 different constructs to really measure student agency. We did a survey in the fall of 2017 and again in 2018 of students and of teachers. So I want to walk quickly through how we were thinking about how to measure agency, just real quickly. All right, the first kind of construct we used was self-efficacy. So really, the belief in your own ability to achieve your goals. So we had some questions about, and on each of these slides will be a sample question, as well as the research base that we used for that question. I will also put into the chat box a link to where you can access these surveys. So if you're interested in surveying your students or your teachers to get information about how students are perceiving their own agency, please feel free to use those. They are in part of the technical appendix in the report. So we'll put those in the chat box so that you can take a look at those down the road. So self-efficacy is one of them. Another one was consistency of interest. So are you, over a long period of time, what is the tendency or what is your ability to really stay focused and keep a focus on a similar group of interests over a long period of time? Perseverance of effort is if, again, over time, but whether or not you are in the face of challenges or frustrations or unanticipated bumps in the road, the extent to which you're really able to stay focused and then exert effort in addressing those. Another one, or aspect of agency, is around locus of control. So the degree to which students reported that they feel they have control over the outcomes of events. Mastery orientation. So again, the extent to which students feel they have, or they're able to really master a task and be able to be successful. That kind of gets to the, if you think back to the original slide that had our definition, manage learning and be successful. So are they able to do that? So this is the one I trip over anytime I try to say it out loud. Metacognitive self-regulation is really about how students approach their learning, how they are, monitoring or checking in on their own understanding, how they kind of self-assessing and having control over their learning. Self-regulated learning, very, very similar. Really, again, how are they able to take control or evaluate their learning and behavior? And then future orientation. So we ask questions about the extent to which students are really thinking about the future and anticipating what might come and being able to plan for the future and think ahead. So those 8 kind of big constructs were what we used to develop the surveys, both for, again, the students and the teachers. And they were really snapshots in time. So how did students feel at the beginning of the year? How were they feeling at the end of the year? And in our report, if you really want to dig into the measures and how they worked and how that changed over time, we have a lot of information in there. And again, we can put a link to that report, and can you identify the pages? So if you're a data person or a research person and want to dig in there, it's there. But wanted to just give you a quick overview here, knowing that we were measuring that, but the networked improvement community really got into more practical day-to-day classroom-based measures. So now we've talked a little bit about how we defined and measured it. Next, I want to talk to you about how teachers then, or what teachers reported as instructional practices that they used then in order to promote agency. And these are teacher-reported practices. So do you want to say, like, you won't find these in the literature, or each practice doesn't have a robust literature base behind it yet? One of the things we were hoping with the study is we would learn more through the NIC about which practices worked and which didn't. But one of the things we did was have focus groups in each of these 4 schools. We had about 40 teachers from across content areas and across grade levels. Though I should mention all of these, all of the study were focused in high schools, so 9 to 12. And one of the things we asked them as part of these focus groups are really like, what practices are you using to support and promote, to build agency among their students? And we took those responses and we analyzed the data, and what we did was take the data from those focus groups to identify a set of 17 practices that, again, teachers in these 4 high schools felt that they used in order to promote agency. We're going to talk a little bit about those practices. If it's a little blurry on your screen, Melanie just put the link to those, a standalone document PDF. It'll be much easier to read that you can access that's available on the JFF website. And so we identified these 17 practices that could be then further categorized into 3 buckets. Student opportunities, in which students really were the primary drivers and decision makers in how the instructional practice was implemented. Collaboration, so students and teachers, practices that they were working together to implement that practice. And then the third category or bucket were really teacher-led approaches. So practices that still had the teacher kind of more in the driver's seat in terms of being responsible for how that practice was implemented. And these practices really were the starting point, and you'll hear when we talk about the NIC how important it is to have kind of a really clear understanding of kind of what the problem is, but also like what NIC members wanted to test. And so these practices really served as kind of the first input into the thinking that the teachers did within the networked improvement community about which practices that they might want to test. So real briefly, again, I know we want to spend most of the time getting into the fun part of the networked improvement community, but want to talk through some of the, give you a sense of what some of the practices are within these buckets. So in terms of student opportunities, things like choice, revision, student-led instruction, and student reflection. One of the things that we are really excited about the menu of teacher practices is that we intend it to be a living document, and so as I can see, as more research comes out, either through the Student-Centered Research Collaborative or other work, we'll be able to revise this and find out more information about these practices. But the other thing that we were able to find out or collect through the focus groups is we tried to get teachers to also talk about like what were the key elements of each of these practices. So when you look at that link that Melanie put in the chat box, in addition to just the name of the practice and a short description, there's going to be some key elements of each practice that the teachers, again, in this study identified that you might find helpful as you're thinking about maybe trying out one of these practices with your own students or trying to get a sense of what actually, what does revision include. And again, this is reported data from teachers in the study, but I think there's a lot of information you can take from it and use it in your own classroom or with your colleagues. So student opportunities, choice, revision, student-led instruction practices similar to that. Student-teacher collaborations might be things like conferences, so one-on-one conferences where students are getting not just written feedback on their work, but verbal feedback, collaborative goal setting, and really, as we know, how important that positive relationships are, that developing relationship strategy at the top of the list there. Teacher-led approaches might be things more like direct instruction, modeling, scaffolding. Again, one of the things that we know around student-centered learning is trying to, and with student agency, is really having students take ownership of that learning, but there were still some more direct instruction, more teacher-led approaches that emerged from the menu of teacher practices. I know you can't read this, but wanted to show you that those key elements that I mentioned. So when you go to the menu of teacher practices, you will see a lot more information about each of those practices. And again, some of these practices are what we're going to talk about next in terms of how the NIC themselves selected some of them to test, to collect data on, and we'll talk a little bit about what those practical measures were and what some of the outcomes were. But we started, kind of one of the foundational pieces of the NIC work was this inventory or this collection or menu of teacher practices that study schools reported they felt that they used, first of all, but that they also felt promoted student agency. So before we jump into the NIC, wanted to pause quickly in case there were any questions about the menu, either about the practices that were identified, about how it was developed, anything in particular might come to mind about the menu of teacher practices itself before we dive into then how those practices were used as part of the network improvement community component of the study. So I'll give folks a second or two, more than a second or two. I'll give you maybe 10 even. And I'll give you some seconds to pop any questions into the chat box about the menu or the practices.
And while we're waiting for folks to type in their questions right here. I just want to provide sort of a meta level response as a former classroom educator that the value, I think, to many in the field of this kind of presentation of the many strategies that are useful out there is it's taking a really hot concept like agency that many people are bandying about and has many different definitions, and it's helping to provide a clear list of strategies that educators are using right now, yesterday, tomorrow, in the classroom to try to affect those ends, to try to provide and establish and get out of the way of so that students can experience agency in their learning opportunities and learning activities. That in itself is a fantastic deliverable for the field where folks, systems level leaders, even state legislators, classroom building level leaders can say, oh, actually, there is a tight set of things that can help us get to that. Here they are. And then let's dig deeper to figure out which ones are more successful and for which populations and under what conditions. Lots of questions to ask still. So I'm looking at the chat here. I'm not seeing any questions yet for people about how this study, how you got to this list or where it went. And so I'm going to suggest that if we don't get any here, that we can kind of keep rolling on.
Okay, sounds good. And so if you do have questions, drop them in the chat box and I can answer them. But I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Carrie Schultz, who's going to take the reins and talk about the networked improvement community.
Thanks, Tori. Hello, everyone. In this portion of the webinar, I'm going to share information about the networked improvement community that we formed to accomplish 3 major goals. This portion should probably take about 15 minutes, and then we're hoping to reserve plenty of time for questions. So if you have questions that come to mind and you don't want to lose track of them, please put them in the chat box, and Eric and Melanie will be tracking those for us so that we can get to them in just a little bit. So back to our 3 major goals for the networked improvement community. First, we wanted to respond to the need for more evidence-based practices. As Tori mentioned, the research literature lacks specific practical instructional strategies to promote student agency. And our second goal was to ensure that teachers were able to learn quickly about what works for whom and under what conditions. Our last goal was to build teachers' data and measurement muscle, so they might continue to use similar improvement processes to identify effective practices once this project was complete. As Tori mentioned, we formed a NIC with 4 high schools from the New Tech Network. Here you can see they were spread across 3 states in the Midwest region. For those who have limited to no experience with the networked improvement communities, or NICs for short, this slide just briefly summarizes what a NIC is. In short, it's a collaborative research partnership that combines the principles of improvement science, which we'll talk about in just a couple minutes, within networks of organizations so that they may learn from the varied implementations of new ideas across different contexts. Participants in the NICs identify a problem that's common across their contexts and engage in rapid cycles of design, implementation, testing, and redesign to develop solutions. NICs have been seen as an alternative to what some see as the limitations of traditional approaches to research, such as randomized controlled trials, which tend to focus on whether an intervention works. Traditional research often provides little information about why an intervention might work. Instead, NICs test interventions, also known as change ideas, across varied contexts to determine what works for whom, when, and under what circumstances. In doing so, NICs provide information about change ideas that is much more useful to practitioners who are considering implementing a particular change idea in their own context. According to Tony Breik and colleagues, NICs have 4 defining features. I'm going to walk through each one. The first one here is that they are focused on a well-specified aim. Think of this aim as like a SMART goal for the NIC. Associates in process improvement identify 3 important improvement questions that guide the work of the NIC. First question is, what specifically are we trying to accomplish? By answering this question, participants set an aim to guide their work. The aim should be specific, measurable, realistic, and time-bound. For example, if you were to join a NIC like the one we are discussing today, you'd begin by developing an aim statement like this one. By April 2018, we will increase the percentage of our high school students who participate in extension and/or support activities over the course of a project or unit of study. Each school in our NIC then had to determine their own baseline for that aim and the percentage of students they would like to see improve over the course of the study. The second defining feature of a NIC is that it's guided by a deep understanding of the problem. So often, myself included, we suffer from solutionitis. We seek to fix a perceived problem before we actually can understand it. One way to better understand a problem is to conduct a root cause analysis. A root cause analysis focuses participants on answering why questions. Specifically, why does this problem occur and why does it keep occurring? Participants keep asking why until they have a deep understanding of the factors that contribute to the problem. The third defining feature of NICs is that they are disciplined by the rigor of improvement science. Improvement science is simply a method and set of tools for solving a specific problem. This method involves repeated mini experiments in which change ideas are tested through a continuous improvement process, such as plan, do, study, act cycles. You've probably heard of plan, do, study, act cycles, or maybe you've called them plan, do, check, act, or even plan, do, review. Regardless of the specific type of inquiry cycle, an important feature of improvement science is that the users of the change idea or intervention are fully engaged in the testing process. That's in contrast to the traditional approaches to research in which external researchers are solely responsible for carrying out the study. I want to walk through each of the 4 phases of the plan, do, study, act cycle to show you what I mean. I'm going to talk specifically about what our NIC members did. So during the plan phase, NIC members developed the foundation for their work. They began by identifying a change in practice that addresses barriers to their ability to promote student agency in their classrooms. Earlier, I mentioned that there are 3 core improvement questions. The second improvement question was, what change might we introduce and why? The change idea does not need to be a radical change. It can simply be a tweak in practice. What's most important is that it directly addresses the root causes underlying that problem and is motivated by a theory about why that change idea will likely improve students' ability to demonstrate agency. After identifying the change idea, NIC participants made predictions about what they expect will happen, and they developed a plan to monitor their progress. Here is where participants answer the third and final improvement question. How will we know that the change is an actual improvement? They designed measures tied to their theory of improvement, and these measures were designed to be practical. And what we mean by that is they became a part of their regular routine and were not a burden to implement. To complete the final step in the plan phase, NIC members define the specific roles of those involved in implementing and measuring the change idea, the measures they'd use, as well as how often they would implement the change idea and collect the data. They also decided how often they would meet amongst themselves to discuss their implementation of the change idea and how many plan, do, study, act cycles they intended to complete. That's a lot in the plan phase. Now let's move to do, the actual work. Then participants collected data to monitor improvement using the practical measures they developed during the plan phase. My favorite phase, we moved into the study section. After implementing their change idea for a specific period of time, typically 4 to 6 weeks in the case of our NIC, participants in the NIC came back together to analyze data and interpret their findings. Our team at AIR created easy to understand data visualizations for the NIC members to review. We then walked through a protocol to discuss their observations, questions, and action plans for the next plan, do, study, act cycle. As a result of those conversations, participants decided how to proceed with their change idea, using their data analysis for guidance. And then we repeated the process. Each PDSA cycle built on the prior cycle, providing participants with the opportunity to continuously refine their change idea as well as their measures as they work to achieve their aim. Now, as I mentioned, one of the first steps to preventing ourselves from jumping to solutions is to honor the problem and invest time to understand it. We did this through an exercise in which the teachers identified barriers they experience or observe that prevent the promotion of student agency. Take a minute to predict what the teachers reported. Share your prediction by writing to everyone in the chat box. What do you think teachers said prevented them from promoting student agency? Your predictions can't be wrong because they're your predictions. Great. I see someone saying lack of time. Actually, two folks. They don't know how to teach it. Maybe they're unfamiliar about how to promote agency in their classroom. Time again. Great. Thank you very much. Now, I want to reveal to you what the teachers shared with us. I should begin by saying that the teachers' responses fell into 4 major categories. There were classroom-level barriers that the NIC members perceived and reported. There were school-level barriers related to teachers' time, as several of you already pointed out, as well as their ability to accept their own mistakes and fail fast when trying new approaches. And relatedly, just like someone already put in the chat box, they share that it's often difficult to be the guide on the side rather than the sage on the stage because they haven't been trained to teach that way. Moving outside of the school building, teachers reported community-level barriers. They shared that there might be competing priorities in students' homes or lack of reinforcement and resources for promoting student agency. And finally, the last major category was instructional infrastructure. And that referred to these 3 barriers. We don't know what works for whom and under what conditions. They also shared that there's a lack of curricular materials related to agency. And finally, they also said that there's a lack of formative measures to actually track whether students are promoting agency. So I should mention that this group was unique in that they were actually pre-formed around this last bullet here of the lack of formative measures. They were a working group of different schools that wanted to focus on how can we better measure student agency. And so they were really primed for this improvement community. So just a quick check. I know a lot more has been entered into the chat box while I was going over those 4 big buckets. Looks like several of you had a lot of correct predictions. So well done. Maybe some of these resonate or actually map onto your own experiences. So know that you're not alone. So we asked the teachers which barriers or root causes they have in their own locus of control. Clearly, some of these are more in their own locus of control than others. And which one, if they changed, would lead to the most improvements for their students? So on the next slide, you'll see that the teachers selected instructional infrastructure as the place where they wanted to invest the most energy. We then worked with the NIC to develop a driver diagram. This is a common tool used in improvement science to connect the NIC's aim statement to the mechanisms the NIC believes will lead to the improved outcomes. The primary driver is the improvement community's best bet about what to change to promote student agency. You see here that they had 3 to consider. The first is instructional systems. And that means how teachers organize instruction so that a diverse set of extension and support activities are used and constantly embedded as opportunities for students. For example, in our NIC, students might be offered multiple pathways to master a particular lesson. They might be offered videos, optional workshops, etc. The formative measures driver was referring to the teacher's desire to develop systematic ways to track students' efforts to access extension and or support activities and resources. And lastly, this is a nuanced driver where they were thinking about how important it would be to support students to put forth effort during challenges and use effective strategies when accessing those additional supports and extension activities. In the end, the NIC chose to prioritize instructional systems as its primary driver. With an aim, an understanding of the problem, and a preferred primary driver in place, we were finally able to begin the Plan, Do, Study, Act cycle. As I mentioned earlier, one of the underpinnings of this work is that we can get better by clearly defining the change idea we want to test, quickly test that change idea, reflect on its implementation and results, and then either refine the change idea, adopt it, or abandon it and decide that we would like to implement a different change idea that should be tested. In parallel to launching the NIC, as Tori mentioned, we were also conducting a broader study about student agency across the 4 schools. As a reminder, these were the results of the student-led opportunities that came out of the focus groups that we conducted. I'm going to move on because Tori already defined these for us. The NIC members focused on these student-led opportunities and decided upon these change ideas. Now, typically, all members in a NIC will select the same change idea to test. However, we learned that the teachers' readiness levels to test particular change ideas varied across the school's context. So, they selected a change idea that they believed they would be able to implement well. Each change idea was aligned to the primary driver I mentioned earlier, and the members hypothesized how it would likely help them to achieve the overall aim for the NIC. The student choice change idea refers to students where are able to select the resources and supports they believe that would help them meet their learning goals. With a student voice change idea, students were provided input on the types of resources they would like to use during the course of the unit, and the teachers used that input as part of their planning process. For the student self-reflection change idea, students completed a brief survey at the beginning of each week to reflect on their mastery, the resources they used the previous week, and the resources they might use this following week so that they can better master the topic. We then also looked at how common these student-led ideas were actually implemented across the 4 schools. As you can see on this slide, from the fall teacher survey, which included the NIC members and beyond, these practices were not all that common. For all of them, fewer than a third of the teachers reported that they used these practices more than 3 times per week with most of their students. This suggested to us that there was definitely room for improvement, and it was right for the NIC work to get underway. So on the next slide, I want to show you what the rhythm of the work looked like for the NIC. You can see the central feature is the Plan, Do, Study, Act cycle, and we engaged in 2 rounds of these cycles with the NIC members. February and March was our first round. We would then convene the NIC to share results and to learn from one another, and then conduct the Plan, Do, Study, Act cycle again in March and April with the final convening in the spring. For a sneak peek into one of the school's experiences in the NIC, we invited you to watch this video prior to today's webinar. If you didn't have the time, please take a look in the near future. The NIC members describe their change idea in detail and talk about recommendations for other teachers who want to engage in a NIC. The video also includes this particular school's findings. As a plug, this school will be working with JFF to have a webinar in early 2019. So stay tuned for a notice about that from JFF. Now I want to share some broad findings and lessons learned from our work before we get to your questions. So our findings are organized around 2 research questions. One was a general question that we asked of NIC teachers within the NIC and those who are not participating in the NIC. What practices do teachers use to promote student agency? As you know, these responses were used to develop that menu of practices that Tori and I mentioned earlier. The most commonly reported practice was developing relationships with students. The second research question was specific to the NIC. Teachers with support from AIR developed their own practical measures, and these measures typically consisted of exit slips. Teachers found these very easy to administer, and students were able to complete them in a brief period of time. We wanted to share this quote, and if you can't read it, I will read it aloud for you, from one of the teachers in the NIC. Agency really in the past was like this vague term that, yeah, I want my students to have that. But this was one way that we could actually define and measure a specific aspect of agency that fit within the agency rubric. Now, in terms of the lessons learned from this project, we found that teachers were able to build their data and measurement muscle. One of my favorite quotes came from a teacher who said, "I should have been doing this all along. Instead of throwing spaghetti at the wall and seeing what sticks, I should be measuring my practice. So that was a reflection to me that she was seeing that there was value in building her own capacity to measure student outcomes and her own practice, as well as predicting which short and long-term outcomes might be linked to her own instruction, and mapping out which data sources she should be collecting. The NIC participants learned how to be more purposeful, and they constantly expressed how valuable that experience was for them. Another set of lessons learned include that the network improvement approach allowed teachers to develop their own formative measures, learn how to look at data differently, as well as have an opportunity to set aside time so that they might share change ideas. Oftentimes, teachers work in isolation, and the NIC process helps to break down that isolation and create a more collegial atmosphere. Before we jump to your questions, I wanted to end with this teacher reflection. When it comes to implementing a change idea, I was really excited at the way that we were able to start as a group and come up with a broad range of ideas. Work with other schools and see what their thoughts were, and then decide as a team if we wanted to do all the same change idea. I felt like everybody got on board. We had set times. We knew every 2 weeks we were going to get back together and review things. Now, that is a brief summary, and as Tori mentioned, there are lots of resources that we've been putting into the chat box. But before we get to your questions, I wanted to have Tori share a little bit more about another product we're going to be sending out that pulls all of these resources together for you.
Thanks, Carrie. So one of the things that's always a challenge is trying to figure out how best to share. And I think Eric teed this up really well at the beginning of the webinar. Is how do you share this information and the learning back out into the field in ways that are useful and not, I, again, love the 80-page reports, but not everyone has time, right, to dig through those and look through the data. So trying to find some more user-friendly, practice-friendly ways to share information about the study. And so we'll be sharing with you and with kind of a bonus dissemination piece, what we're calling an e-resource, which is going to be, we hope, a very useful kind of summary of all of the different things we've talked about today. It'll have some additional data from the study that you can tie to the specific practices, so you can see like how frequent were those practices used that the teachers reported in these schools. Additional information about student perceptions and teacher perceptions about how the NIC worked, and additional information that we hope will be packaged a little, again, more user-friendly and more tightly, that you can then peruse on your own time, but also provides a really high-level, quick summary of the key parts of the study. So look for that. We'll be sending that to JFF to send out with the thank yous for the webinar today, for attending today. And hopefully, again, it'll be a brief summary, and if you have any additional questions, again, let us know. But hope to have that as a bonus to today's webinar, because it's just, I know we're talking about a lot in a short amount of time.
So correct me if I'm wrong, Carrie, Tori, this is the time where you're inviting questions from folks, and they can put it in the chat box and we'll curate. Is that correct?
You got it, yep.
Great. So I want to invite anyone and everyone on the call right now to pose your questions for the research team, particularly if they are relevant to the way the study was conducted, implications, specific findings around agency and the various practices that were identified and how they were categorized. The PDSA cycles had a rich plan, do, study, act, rapid prototyping that allowed the folks at the New Tech Network schools to dig into a narrowed set of constructs around agency. And that narrowing itself, I think, was an addition or a helpful addition to the field that I think merits a little tighter questioning if folks want to ask about that. While we're waiting for folks to do that, I'd like to offer just one kind of warning to those in the field who are applying and thinking about this research, and that is this. It's really common for people to take research and findings and even their own assumptions about practices and the ways that they're reading into student agency and use it as yet another way to think about or to blame kids for not having the motivation to, quote unquote, want to learn. And I think this study highlights, as most studies, if not all, around student agency, particularly those that are well constructed, that agency is not a way for us to assess students' lack of ability around desiring more educational opportunities. That's not what agency is. Agency is, in many ways, the extent to which we create opportunities for students to explore items and issues and curriculum and questions that have internal locus of control and have an import to them. So to that end, we need to be really careful of when we hear educators and leaders or whatever saying things about agency where my kids just don't hate or they're not interested in learning or they don't have that agency, or what I think Steve Plank said here, that students just want to be told what to do. And I think that's well taken or well put. Many teachers and many people in communities in many places around the world think about students in that regard, and we need to challenge that. And I think agency-based research, agency-based ways of thinking about instruction and assessment is a really great way of opening up ways to show when we create those opportunities, students will jump on them and take them to the ends of the earth. It's really awesome to see things could happen when we do that. So questions for the chats, please post them off to the right and we will curate them right now. It looks like we got one from Lynn Carter. Did this study find an increase in student learning or growth over time? And then her second question that I'd like to get you to is, where did the term student agency come from? So let's go to the first one. Did the study find an increase in student learning or growth over time? Can you address that and how maybe the study really wasn't designed for that? Carrie?
Sure. Yeah. So, Carrie, I'm going to talk about it in the case of kind of the student surveys, and then Carrie can talk a little bit about what the teachers saw in their own classrooms. So we did try. We had an assumption going into the study that we thought it would change over time. I think that we were going into it thinking that we might see some kind of change. And using just those survey measures and those constructs that I talked about at the top of the webinar, those student-level measures of agency, we did not see that they significantly changed over time. Again, the focus was on those practical measures, and I think we saw some growth there that I'll let Carrie talk about, and we heard from teachers that they saw changes over time. But in terms of those surveys, there really wasn't a lot of change. There were two exceptions to that. Perseverance of interest declined, while levels of metacognitive self-regulation slightly increased. And, you know, there's a lot of reasons why that could happen. Surveying students at the beginning of the year has challenges in terms of, like, they're just getting started, and at the end of the year, there's often, you know, at the end of the year fatigue and survey fatigue going on as well. So we noticed, and again, it wasn't it was one question that we had going into the study, but the NIC and the practical measures and the ongoing work of the NIC was the primary focus. But we did not see in that 1 year time period in the survey significant changes between the fall administration and the spring administration. But Carrie, I'll let you talk a little bit about the changes teachers saw in the NIC.
Sure, thanks, Tori. So to Eric's point, one of our goals wasn't to connect agency to specific learning outcomes. It was really to look at, are students demonstrating or able to demonstrate more agency because of changes that teachers make to their own practice. So in terms of the NIC schools, Belleville, that is going to be featured at a future webinar, has some great stories to share about improvements they saw. I won't steal all of their thunder right now, but they did notice that some of their strategies that they implemented really enabled students that typically were quiet and wouldn't ask for support to really draw out what needs they had so that teachers could be more responsive and offer a more student-centered learning space in their classrooms. We had another school that used that provided feedback in different ways and more purposeful ways and consistently across different classrooms. And they also saw improved outcomes related to student agency. Because the NIC did not all implement the same change idea, we're hesitant to talk about these specific practices working across contexts because the numbers were so small. But these schools have told us that they intend on continuing to test these change ideas and to scale them up over time in their schools if they're able to see similar patterns across the NIC teachers that continue to implement, as well as those that have been invited to implement this school year. So we were really encouraged by that.
The second question from Lynn, and I might just quickly address that at a meta level and then ask you too if you want to have any input, was where did the term student agency come from? And right. Having studied and used that term in my own research, that, you know, it comes in many ways, some of the richest insights come from the post-colonial and feminist literature, both theoretical and empirical, where they're investigating and showing the extent to which marginalized populations have a sense of self-determination in their life trajectories, in their daily existence, in their community, in their jobs, in their vocational training, in their significant relationships. To what extent do marginalized populations have agentic experiences where they feel like they are in control of and are self-determined and are following a trajectory of their own creation? And then that was then imported into the educational world, where it mapped onto motivation and engagement and voice and choice, and what we call in the Student-Centered Learning Research Collaborative more often, ownership, the extent to which students have a sense of ownership over their learning, where they can call something theirs, and that there's a sense of creation in it, not just a sense of reception in that movement. And that the agency has become a term from those fields that has become more and more traction within the levels of, you know, classroom practice and policy and systems level change. So Carrie, Tori, anything to add to that about where the locations of the term and where it came from?
I think you got it.
I think you covered it.
I don't.
Okay.
Thanks, Eric.
Right on. So the next question is from Steve Plank, sort of a detailed one here, where he's asking about the extent to which the NIC members were asked to choose from one of 5 different change ideas as their starting points for their plan, do, study, act cycles. And his question was, each of these 5 a very specific strategy, or was it more of umbrella? You know, that is, was there a single, like a student voice strategy that a set of teachers used that was very targeted and very individual, or was it more like a constellation of sort of a bucket of approaches that fell under student voice? Can you clarify that?
Sure. Yeah, great question. So I mentioned earlier that originally we were hoping everyone would decide to implement the same change idea, but we learned that the teachers were in different places with the degree to which they were comfortable using practices that promoted student agency. And so we met individually with each school and walked through, shared with them that menu of teacher practices, which was instrumental to finding out what was already happening in the schools in the study, and then finding out which ones seemed most practical to implement and narrowed it down from there. So they were more of a larger container for various practices that sit under them. And then from there, we had to get really specific about what the change idea would look like. We actually called it a recipe, and we had the teams type up what that recipe would be if others outside of their school wanted to try to implement the same practice. And so we worked, it was very much a funneling process where we went from very broad to much more narrow and specific over time. Eric and Melanie, do we have any other questions?
I think so. Here, Steve, if you have a follow-up question to that one, please feel free to drop it into the chat function. We're happy to, if that didn't catch it. Otherwise, it looks like we are not getting any other questions, so we might move toward concluding here.
So this is Tori. I want to add one other plug for the Belleville webinar, but also for the e-resource. And there's so many parts to this study, But one important part that we didn't talk a lot about today that you'll see in the e-resource is we did have focus groups of students. So we also talked to them about how they perceived and how they engaged in some of these practices. And so I did most of them, and it was just anecdotally just really exciting to hear students talk about how being given choice helps develop their confidence and their independence in their choices, and how giving and receiving feedback to their peers really helps them think about how they're going to be, got future orientation when they're in a job or when they're in college, or and being able to interact with people and problem solve. And so in addition to those teacher practices, as you look through them and as you watch the videos or see what the teachers did on their end with those practices, we also did collect data from the students about their perceptions of those, what types of skills or abilities being allowed or not being allowed, but engaging in those practices with their teachers helps them build. And I'm sure Belleville will talk about their experience with that as well. So I did want to mention that there is a student voice and some of the data we collected as well about those practices that you will see as well.
And one of the schools actually invited a student representative to come and look at the data and help interpret it with us. And so that was a really valuable experience for us as researchers, as well as for the teachers involved in the NIC, to hear the students' real-time reaction to the data.
Fantastic. So unless either of you from AIR have any concluding remarks, I'd be happy to wrap it up right now. Does that work for you?
Yes,
it does. Thank you.
Perfect.
Thank you, everyone.
So what I would like just to point out about this is that this study is coming at a perfect time for us, I think, as a nation. I think for those of us connected to educational research and thinking about implementation and scaling up best practices across the country, or even just locally or regionally. We're coming off of years of No Child Left Behind and Race to the Top that were very focused on content delivery, content reception, and content regurgitation. And that is not a very agentic experience for the learner. It is not a very student-centered experience for the learner. It doesn't position the learner very often in a place where they feel like they can own the learning, do something with the learning, and feel like it was driven by their own intrinsic desires and needs and where they see their life trajectories going. And what this research points out is the need to reattach ourselves to the best practices that can foment those kind of experiences for students, so that they see learning as a springboard to their own possibilities and their own future aspirations and where they feel most inspired and most interested. Learning in many ways can be most productive, and we can achieve the greatest levels of academic outcomes, social outcomes, when students feel deeply connected to the task at hand, to the people around them that are doing those work, and to the questions that are driving their inquiries. And I think this research helps to underscore that the importance of agency in that work. So I want to thank the team from AIR. I want to commend everyone to read the full long study and also the sets of materials that will be coming out subsequent to this point. There'll be, as they mentioned, other videos that will be attached to this, and we'll have some other field-facing deliverables that will be associated with it. And as always, the Student-Centered Learning Research Collaborative is always conducting research. We're always working to translate it for policymakers and classroom educators, building level leaders, funders and foundations out there who may be interested in trying to see where the best places are to fill evidence gaps so that we can try to build this field and move it forward, achieve greater equity. So I want to thank you all for attending today. If you have any questions for us, if you'd like to follow up with us, if you'd like to check in with some of our resources, as always, please go to Students at the Center Hub or to the Student-Centered Learning Research Collaborative page at the JFF website. We are always updating it on a daily, weekly, monthly basis with new resources, including the kinds of hot off the presses research from teams like AIR and many other research teams that we support. And a quick plug, we're looking for a new cohort of distinguished fellows. The application that Melanie put into the chat function that you'll see off to the right. Couldn't have been more thrilled to work with the AIR team. Thank you again for Carrie and Tori, and good luck to you, and we hope to see you soon. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.